This is Duke University.
So, trade and exchange rates. If you've been watching the news lately in the last week, at the time he wasn't quite approved yet, but now our Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner is testifying in front of Congress, in front of the Senate, saying President Obama, backed by conclusions of a broad range of economists, believes that China is manipulating its currency. And of course, the reason that this is important is because these economists who believe this, and in particular politicians, I should say, especially who believe this, believe that this manipulation of macroeconomic policy, of exchange rate policy, has trade implications. And if you ask sort of anyone who studies IPE or macro, this is sort of a no-brainer. Of course, in theory, exchange rate movements have trade policy implications, et cetera. But what Mark and I were sort of interested in is this question of, do governments manipulate exchange rates to influence terms of trade? And in particular, Corden, now over 2 decades ago, 25 years ago, sort of coined this term exchange rate protection. That through either the devaluation of an exchange rate, through allowing an exchange rate to depreciate precipitously, through intervening in markets to prevent currency appreciation, that a state could improve its terms of trade by, of course, letting its exchange rate vary over time, in particular, usually depreciating. And so, given this, Corden asked, can we find and do we find evidence? And there was a small literature in the 80s, McKinnon, among others, sort of asking this question of, do states manipulate exchange rates to influence terms of trade? Now, as we'll get to in a minute, this is notoriously hard to figure out. In fact, one reason they do this is because it's not particularly detectable. Makes it a nice policy tool, makes it a difficult research question. And so that's sort of the things we'll talk about is our attempt to untangle this. But then I began, as Mark was telling me about this literature, I began thinking, well, the other way a country could clearly resolve a trade problem or an exogenous shock in the trade realm is, of course, to throw up tariffs, right? Or put up some type of non-tariff barrier to try to improve terms of trade that way. But of course, the one thing that's happened in the global economy over the last 30 years is we've had this proliferation of preferential trade agreements. In other words, states signing free trade agreements, binding themselves not to raise tariffs, and in theory, not to use quotas, NTBs, et cetera, which, if nothing else, violate the spirit of these agreements. And you've also had the movement from the GATT to the WTO, which sort of has a tighter legal binding, in theory anyway, on states, again, throwing up these tariffs. And so we started asking sort of what happens if a state has this problem. They're getting sort of beat up on in the trade world. They can't use tariffs to fix the problem. Would they resort to something akin to exchange rate protection? And would we find states that join these PTAs be more likely to do this? We know historically, and again, if sort of ask anyone in IPE or macroeconomics, there's sort of very clear ideas that exchange rates have trade implications. That's not groundbreaking whatsoever. And that there are various reasons, there are then various influences that these trade flows may have on a state's choice of exchange rates, fixed versus flexible / floating, et cetera. All these PTAs are not the same. And I mentioned earlier, there's many ways you could differentiate these PTAs. And these last 2 bullet points deal with that. Some of these PTAs say, okay, free trade, all goods, right away, make it happen. Some of these say over 10 years we're going to cut tariffs. Some of these say over 5 years we'll cut tariffs on half our goods. Right? There's broad variation, and so we've assumed that the PTA is covering the bulk of the goods or all the goods moving between borders in members. That's not always the case. Unfortunately, there's sort of no good measure of which PTAs cover which goods over which time. I'm working on that now. It's something I'd like to build in to get sort of a more fine-grained measure of trade coverage specificity. And finally, I've just finished a data set updating some work by James McCall Smith on dispute settlement mechanisms within these PTAs. If we think the legalism in the WTO is doing important work, we should look at legalism within PTAs. Again, these vary broadly. Some of these PTAs have extensive courts attached to them. Some of these PTAs have nothing, where they just say, if we have a dispute, we'll work it out, we'll figure it out. About 2 sentences. And so I've just completed a data set sort of differentiating levels of what you could call legalism or dispute settlement within these various arrangements. And so, again, if you think legal bindingness matters, maybe that is the way to weight or to think about differentiating these PTAs instead of trade coverage. So it turns out, myself included, everyone who's modeled PTA sort of puts in a trade variable. And lo and behold, trade is always positively correlated with joining these things. But it turns out if you just make it quadratic, you get a much better fitting model, right? States with really low trade join these things, and states with really high trade join these things, right? Which is sort of why I now kind of believe that there are these two types that exist. But you're right. So, but what I haven't done then is to say, okay, in the second type, maybe exchange rates would influence one type and not the other in terms of accession. And so that I think would be the next step on that. So yes, so you would look at the drop in the nominal exchange rate. It turns out we are doing that. I did that about 11 o'clock last night before I hopped on the plane this morning, and we get very similar results.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.